So this study, which was actually my dissertation study, came out of looking at, actually before I get into this, let me say the background of this study was the observation during my consulting career that how people behaved in a game and how they behaved in the office tended to correspond. That people who were good problem solvers in a game tended to be also good problem solvers in an office. And people who were not good problem solvers in a game tended to give up easily in a work setting. And also similar behaviors around leadership and so on. And this inspired me to want to look further into this phenomenon. This particular study was looking at how LARPers view leadership, decision-making, and working with a group. And what you'll notice about all three of these topics is that although we can talk about them, although there are volumes of literature about them, particularly leadership, we cannot actually define exactly what any of them are. In fact, we cannot even agree on who is a good leader, or even what a leader is. And anyone who thinks we can unambiguously define a leader, I have 6 words: Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders. Okay. This is a psychological study with its roots in Goffman's dramaturgical model and Peter Osorio's descriptive psychological model. And descriptive psychology is a quasi-mathematical structure for explaining human behavior in dramaturgical terms. I did this as a constructivist grounded theory study, so a qualitative analysis. It had 14 participants, 8 male, 6 female, and data was obtained through an open-ended questionnaire. People were encouraged and in fact wrote, on average, probably about 5 pages of dense type each person. So I had about 60, 70, 80, somewhere around that pages of data at the end of this, which was then analyzed according to Kathy Sharmaz's methods of grounded theory development. Now, I should mention that although in recruiting for this study, I was trying to draw people from all different forms of LARP, primarily what I got were people who had played in interactive literature styles of LARP. 13 of the 14 participants had played interactive literature style. Now, this is not a term most people have heard. So I want to quickly mention interactive literature style, and in particular what we had here came out of the hybrid of the MIT Assassins Guild, which I started, and the Society for Interactive Literature at Harvard. So it is an MIT-Harvard hybrid style of gaming. And the primary thing is that the plotting tends to be much, much denser than anyone imagines could be done. Think of writing a game that should last for 10 days and doing it in 2. That's a typical IL style game. In this study, participants were asked a total of 22 questions that were divided into questions based around leadership, decision-making, working with a group, and then a final catch-all question of the form, is there anything else you'd like to tell me? The coding process, there's something like 380 codes, I don't know, something like that. You can actually read all the codes if you really want to wade through the dissertation, which they make me repeat things a lot because it's a dissertation, it has to be very formal. You can find all the codes. The analysis process yielded at the end 11 theoretical codes that really sort of captured what people were describing and talking about. And the first one, of course, people described leadership as a complex social process, which was, many participants described this as a big change for them. They saw leadership as standing there and giving orders. And then they played LARPs, or in some cases, they started playing LARPs as teenagers and never really gave a lot of thought to leadership, and then playing LARPs for many years started to see this differently. But they started realizing leadership was this very complex social interaction between leaders and followers, or technically really leaders and other group members. That leaders were just a part of the group, just had a very defined role. And one of the things that really came out was they felt that LARPing had helped them see that underlying framework of leadership, where they could actually see and come to a better understanding of why leaders acted the way they did. One of the best comments I got from one participant was that playing in LARP took all of those things you read in psychological studies about anyone could do evil under the right conditions. And everyone goes, yeah, except for me, I won't. And one participant said, I was supposed to be the head of the good guys, the head of the police organization that was going to stop the terrorists. We did it by becoming them. We did it by figuring out what they were going to do, which governmental positions they were trying to control, and controlling them ourselves. In other words, they essentially became just as evil in the name of doing good. And the comment was, it wasn't until I did that I understood that it could happen to me. And now when I look at a leader doing something I don't agree with, I always wonder, what do they think they're really trying to, what good do they believe they're trying to accomplish? What is motivating them? What's going on? So there's that deeper awareness. Similarly, a similar pattern emerged around decision-making. That decision-making is not just simply going up and saying, this, no, that, we'll do that. Again, there's a complex social and psychological process that occurs in decision-making, which, interestingly enough, the descriptions that participants gave of the decision-making process was corresponded very well to Baumeister's work on decision-making and willpower. How decision-making degrades over time, how tired people make worse, more conservative decisions. And again, of course, they described LARP as illuminating this process more clearly. One of the participants specifically commenting that, wow, making this decision, what really the group really needed was more energy, not more information. Okay. Similar point came out about group work. One participant said, I always saw groups as this sort of scary thing that I wanted to stay away from and just do my own work. And he sort of realized through LARPing that groups were this complex, and I use the term loosely, living entity. That the group essentially takes on a life of its own. And again, LARPing helps illuminate that process and help participants become more aware of that social interaction that goes into a group learning how to develop effective working relationships. And their descriptions, also of how they perceive groups in the future and how they imagine groups working was very consistent with Susan Whelan's adapted model or updated model of Tuckman stages of group development. That it's essentially, there is a process of clear relational development occurring in the lifespan of a group. And LARPers found that to become more accessible through play. And I realized I'm using the term play a lot, and I have not actually defined it. So I want to just let me quickly say I'm using play in the term developed by D.W. Winnicott, British psychologist, who defined play as the ability to explore the world in a safe way. That we explore the world and we come to understand how the world works through the act of play. Play for children can be very simple. Play for adults needs to be more complex. But it's a safe place in that there are no long-term real-world consequences to play. So, coming back to this, the other thing that came out of the playing in LARPs was people became more aware of the need for diversity of opinion in making good decisions. And I mean, I could have put this tolerance for different backgrounds under decision making, but it really seemed to stand out on its own. That LARPers, the people in the site described the fact that they had played in this LARP as making them more aware of different perspectives, different ways of seeing the world, and the importance of taking all of them into account. As one person put it, everybody has a different opinion and they're all valid, at least in the early stages. Another thing that came up was, again, an increased awareness of complexity of situation. And what I found was a very interesting comment was the idea that people said that they would start to look at the real world as though it was a LARP. And in other words, what they said was, very explicitly, if I couldn't do this, I'd think back to when I played a character who did, and then I would become that character. Oh, I have to buy a car? Well, I don't know how to negotiate. But this character that I played sure negotiated well. I'll be that character. I sort of, personally, how they put it, said, I load that character into memory while I do my negotiation. And I suppose you could consider that a form of bleed. But it is very consistent with a point that Peter Osorio makes in descriptive psychology. People become what they are treated as being. In a LARP, if you are doing negotiation and you are successful, which means that people have treated you as being successful, you become better at it. The fact that it's a fictional situation doesn't really matter. And then finally, a point came up from a lot of participants that they saw LARP as a sandbox, okay, and which they were able to then explore the world. What came out of this was then an analytic narrative, which I will just summarize here. But the basic concept that people said, they came from this process of feeling like they're in this totally confusing environment to this increasing awareness of being a part of an organic entity and in a symbiotic relationship with the leader and with each other. That everybody was part of this symbiotic environment. And that, as several participants said, I always thought that leaders had to be born leaders. Now I know you can learn it. Mentioned this idea of context, and really several participants again said they felt their whole worldview had been completely altered by being in this game. The theory that comes out of this, again consistent with other literature, is that if your role play is sufficiently real, and real can have a lot of different meanings, in this case, very heavily social reality, then it increases learning. That social reality still creates a form of reality, even if you're playing in an environment that has no physical correspondence to the medieval castle or the flying city or anything else. If enough people agree that you're in a floating castle, you're in a floating castle. It's just you don't fall so far when you walk off the edge. And complexity of the game helps create that sense of reality. Now, a few limitations on this study. Everyone, with the exception of one person who did SCA, was an interactive literature style LARPer. Qualitative studies, of course, tend to be small. There were only 14 participants. And all the participants were American, had only played American LARPs. Everyone in the study was a college graduate. Many of them had postgraduate degrees. Very heavily weighted toward MIT, Harvard, Stanford, elite schools. So further research on this includes looking at these effects with different LARP styles, with non-American LARPs and non-American LARPers. Looking more deeply into this question of how LARPs and under what conditions do LARPs best help people develop a tolerance and awareness of differences. And also a question that came out of this was, do LARPs require that player actions be perceived as free? In other words, this whole concept of free, active, public, and effortful. In other words, if you are forced by a games master to play your character in a very specific way, will you still benefit from these experiences in the LARP? And social psychological theory would argue that probably you would benefit less or not at all the more you are forced to play a specific way. Whereas if the game simply allows the behaviors to come so that you feel that you are choosing them freely, you're more likely to benefit from it. So the main points here is that LARP is a particularly immersive role-playing experience and can illuminate and teach behaviors that we cannot easily define. That although the experience is fictional, the storyline is fictional, the experience translates back to the real world, and that LARPs can be used as part of training leaders, building more effective teams, and teaching groups to make better decisions. And then for those who want to look at references, there's a whole lot of them. I will quickly mention that I also have done some work around using LARPs for organizational training, and that's discussed in one of my books. I'll be happy to talk about that in the hallway or answer questions at the end. Thank you.